He was a giant of a man from a forgotten corner of Africa, a soldier who rose from the ranks of a colonial army to seize an entire country in a single, decisive strike. To some, in the beginning, he looked like a simple, smiling strong man who spoke the language of ordinary people and promised to end corruption. To others, he soon became a nightmare in uniform, a ruler whose name would be whispered in fear: Idi Amin. This is the story of Uganda's most infamous dictator, a man who began life in a poor village near the Nile and ended it in quiet exile beside the Red Sea. It is the story of how a boy who carried water for his mother became a boxer, a soldier, and finally a president who covered his country with mass graves. It follows Amin's rise through the British colonial army, his alliance and conflict with Uganda's first leaders, the coup that made him head of state, and the 8 brutal years that followed. You will hear how he charmed crowds with jokes and dances while his secret police filled prisons and rivers with bodies, how he expelled an entire community in 90 days, wrecking his country's economy with one signature, how he played the superpowers against each other, backed hijackers, taunted his neighbors, and finally launched a reckless war he could not win. And you will follow him into his last years, not on trial before the world, but sitting in a soft chair in Saudi Arabia, watching the country he once ruled from a distance he would never cross again. This is the whole story of Idi Amin, the boy from West Nile, the general in dark glasses, and the dictator whose rule turned Uganda into a land of fear. Idi Amin was born in the 1920s in the far northwestern corner of what would become Uganda, in a region known as West Nile. The land there is hot and rough, cut by small rivers, close to the borders with Sudan and what was then the Belgian Congo. His family belonged to the Kakwa people, a small ethnic group often ignored by the distant colonial administrators. His childhood was shaped by poverty, hard work, and strict obedience. His father was absent for much of his life, and his mother, a strong and deeply religious woman, dominated his early world. As a boy, he fetched water, tended goats, and walked long distances on bare feet. The village was small, and the horizon of his world was limited to the fields, the dusty paths, and occasional visits to market towns. There were no grand prospects of education or travel. Schooling, where it existed, was thin and uneven. He picked up a little reading and writing here and there, but he never received a full formal education. What he did discover early, however, was his body. He realized that he was stronger and larger than most boys around him. From street games and fights, he moved naturally toward sports. Boxing, in particular, gave him a sense of power and purpose. In makeshift rings, under the sun or beneath dim lights in rough halls, he learned how to move, how to punch, how to take a blow and keep coming. Victories in early bouts brought him attention. People noticed the big young man with the heavy fists and easy smile. Being feared and admired at the same time became a sensation he did not easily forget. The British colonial army, the King's African Rifles, offered young men like him food, pay, a uniform, and an escape from the narrow life of the village. Amin joined in his late teens, trading the world of small fields and family quarrels for the rigid world of barracks and drills. The army became his school. He learned how to march, how to shoot, and how to obey commands shouted in English. He also learned how the colonial system worked. White officers on top, African soldiers below, with discipline enforced by strict punishment and constant surveillance. In the King's African Rifles, he was sent on various operations across East Africa. He served in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising, where the British forces used harsh methods to crush resistance. In this environment, brutality was not an exception, it was part of the arsenal. Amin built a reputation as a fearless and aggressive soldier, someone who rushed forward when others hesitated. There were stories of beatings, of rough interrogations, of prisoners who did not leave the camps alive. Whether each story was true or not, they painted a picture of a man for whom violence was a natural tool. The British, for all their suspicion of his methods, saw his usefulness. He was promoted through the non-commissioned ranks and eventually became one of the African soldiers, allowed to climb higher in the structure as independence movements grew stronger. As the tide of history shifted and the Union Jack slowly came down in African capitals, men like Amin were transformed from colonial troops into the backbone of new national armies. Uganda gained independence in 1962. The new state was fragile, stitched together from different kingdoms, ethnic groups, and regions that had been grouped under one flag by colonial convenience. Its first prime minister and later president, Milton Obote, tried to balance all these forces while building a modern government. Obote needed the army, and in the army he needed strong figures who could ensure loyalty. Idi Amin, by then a tall, imposing officer with a booming laugh and a natural showman's flair, was one of them. In public, the relationship between Obote and Amin looked solid. The politician and the soldier appeared side by side at ceremonies, united in speeches about nation building and development. In private, tensions grew. Obote's government became embroiled in scandals and accusations of corruption. Amin's name surfaced in connection with missing funds and secret arms deals, especially involving operations in Congo, where Ugandan forces interacted with rebel movements. There were whispers that Amin was enriching himself and building his own network inside the army. Obote faced political opposition from his rivals and from traditional kingdoms. He suspended the constitution and dissolved regional structures, centralizing power in his own hands. Opponents accused him of sliding toward dictatorship. In this climate of suspicion, the relationship between the president and his top general became dangerously unstable. Obote's supporters feared that Amin might use the army to seize power. Amin, in turn, suspected that Obote was planning to arrest or sideline him. On January 25, 1971, the tension broke. Obote traveled abroad to attend a Commonwealth meeting. While he was away, Amin moved. Soldiers loyal to him took control of strategic points in the capital, Kampala. Tanks rolled into the streets. Radio Uganda was seized. Key government buildings and communication centers came under military control. The operation was swift, resistance was minimal. By the time ordinary Ugandans fully understood what was happening, the power had shifted. Idi Amin's voice came over the radio, announcing that the army had decided to take control of the country. He accused Obote's government of corruption and mismanagement. He promised that the military would restore order and eventually return Uganda to civilian rule. To many people, exhausted by rising tensions and economic difficulties, his words sounded like a fresh start. Crowds took to the streets cheering the new strongman, some of them dancing, some waving branches and flags. Amin understood the importance of image. He moved quickly to present himself as a man of the people. He released some political prisoners, including opponents of Obote. He ordered a respectful state funeral for the former Baganda king, whose body had been buried in exile, and publicly paid homage to him. This won him support among the Baganda, one of Uganda's largest groups. He appeared on radio and in public squares speaking in plain language, using local idioms, joking, laughing, and promising justice. He made sure television and newspapers showed him as a friendly giant dancing in front of crowds, eating with soldiers, lifting children in his arms. He played the role of the warm-hearted father of the nation, accessible, funny, and generous. For a while, many Ugandans believed him. Foreign governments, too, accepted the new leader. Some saw him as a more reliable partner than Obote, who had leaned toward socialism and experimented with nationalizations. A resumed diplomats shook his hand. Behind this stage performance, Amin was already securing his grip on power in ruthless ways. He knew that the army could also be his greatest enemy. The officers and soldiers who remained loyal to Obote, especially those from particular ethnic groups such as the Akoli and Longo, were seen as potential threats. He began purging the army, removing or demoting those he did not trust, and replacing them with men closer to his own roots in West Nile and from neighboring regions. These purges were not gentle administrative moves, they were often deadly. Some officers were simply arrested and never seen again. Others were executed in barracks, their bodies secretly buried or dumped. Families received no official explanations. Rumors and stories spread in the shadows. Tales of midnight trucks, blindfolded men, and gunshots in remote places. Inside the army, army, fear grew, but so did a new kind of loyalty based on fear and shared guilt. The construction of a police state accelerated. The State Research Bureau and the Public Safety Unit, newly empowered security organizations, expanded quickly. They set up offices and safe houses, interrogation rooms, and torture chambers. Informants were recruited from all parts of society. Drivers, clerks, neighbors, even relatives. People learned that a careless comment in a bar or a joke at a bus stop could be reported and punished. Radios and newspapers became instruments not of information but of propaganda, praising the president and hiding the scale of the violence. Amin's first great act that shook the world came in 1972. One day he announced that all Asians who were not Ugandan citizens had 90 days to leave the country. These families, mostly of Indian and Pakistani origin, had been in East Africa since colonial times. They ran many of the shops, factories, and trading companies that kept Uganda's economy functioning. Amin accused them of economic sabotage, of hoarding wealth, of refusing to integrate with Africans. He framed their expulsion as an act of justice and liberation. The decision threw the country into turmoil. Panic spread among Asian communities. Families scrambled to sell their homes and businesses, pack their belongings, and secure visas to other countries. Many left behind property that they could not legally transfer. Amin's government seized abandoned shops and factories and handed them to his supporters, army officers, and political favorites. People who had never run a business suddenly found themselves in charge of complex operations. The short-term effect looked like a victory for Africanization. Now, visible economic assets were in African hands, but the deeper reality was damage. Without the skills and experience of the expelled entrepreneurs, many businesses collapsed. Machines broke and were not repaired. Inventory was stolen or wasted. Supply chains disintegrated. The quality of goods fell, and shortages multiplied. The economy, already fragile, began to sink under the weight of mismanagement and corruption. Despite this, Amin continued to project confidence. He strutted in elaborate uniforms decorated with countless medals. He gave himself grandiose titles, including Field Marshal and Conqueror of the British Empire in Africa. He liked to present himself as a fearless warrior who had humiliated former colonial masters. Photographs showed him with boxing gloves or holding spears, mixing the image of modern general and traditional African strongman. He enjoyed the theater of power. Public rallies were filled with singing, dancing, and speeches. He improvised jokes that made crowds laugh. He sometimes drove himself through the streets in a convoy, waving from the window, while crowds cheered and soldiers fired guns into the air in celebration. But even as people laughed at his jokes in public, they spoke of him in whispers at home. The same man who cracked jokes could sign death warrants without hesitation. On the international stage, Amin shifted alliances in dramatic fashion. At first, he maintained close ties with Western countries and with Israel, which had helped train parts of Uganda's army. Later, he broke with Israel, denounced Zionism, and aligned himself more closely with Arab leaders, especially Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. He welcomed Palestinian militant groups and other radical movements, presenting himself as a defender of oppressed peoples worldwide. His speeches at international meetings were often fiery, unpredictable, and filled with insults toward Western leaders. One event in particular attached his name permanently to the politics of terror. In 1976, a passenger plane was hijacked and diverted to Entebbe airport near Kampala. The hijackers, who claimed to act for the Palestinian cause, believed they had Amin's support. The hostages were held in the old terminal building, guarded by both militants and Ugandan soldiers. Amin visited them, smiling, promising that everything would be resolved peacefully, and attempting to present himself as a mediator. But another plan was in motion. Israeli commandos, flying secretly over long distances, landed at night, stormed the terminal, and rescued most of the hostages in a sudden, violent raid. The operation was a stunning success for Israel and a deep humiliation for Amin. It revealed that his country's main airport, guarded by his forces, could be penetrated and used against him. In the aftermath, his anger turned inward. Purges intensified. Suspected traitors in the army and state apparatus were imprisoned or killed. By then, the number of people who had died under his rule was already enormous. Teachers, students, clergy, civil servants, soldiers, and ordinary villagers vanished into the machinery of the security state. Some were targeted for their real or imagined political activities. Others fell victim because of ethnic rivalries, personal grudges, or simple misfortune. Rivers carried bodies, mass graves were dug and left unmarked. Uganda's name became synonymous with horror in international headlines. The economy, heavily damaged by the expulsion of Asians and by constant corruption, slid further downward. Factories produced less and less. Imports became more expensive and harder to secure. The national currency shrank in value. In shops, basic goods became scarce. People spent hours in lines, hoping to buy sugar, soap, or fuel. Soldiers at roadblocks demanded bribes, while Amin and his circle lived in luxury with imported cars, fine food, and grand houses. Many citizens struggled just to survive. Watching the situation, other African leaders grew increasingly uneasy. Some had initially welcomed Amin as a fellow leader in the struggle against imperialism, but his erratic behavior, violent purges, and economic disasters made him a problem in the region. One leader in particular, Tanzania's President Julius Nyerere, had long been at odds with him. Nyerere had given refuge to Ugandan exiles, including supporters of Milton Obote and other opponents of Amin. In 1978, Amin made the decision that would ultimately destroy his rule. For reasons that mixed pride, internal politics, and border disputes, he ordered his troops to invade a strip of Tanzanian territory known as the Kagera Salient. Ugandan forces crossed the frontier, looting and causing destruction. Amin declared that the annexed territory was now part of Uganda. He expected Tanzania to back down in the face of his army. Instead, Tanzania responded with full force. Nyerere mobilized his troops and prepared a counteroffensive. Ugandan exiles formed fighting units to join the Tanzanian army. Together, they moved north, pushing out Amin's soldiers from Tanzanian soil and then continuing into Uganda itself. The war that followed exposed the weakness of Amin's army, which had been hollowed out by years of purges and had developed a habit of terrorizing civilians, rather than fighting disciplined battles. As Tanzanian and Ugandan rebel forces advanced, many of Amin's troops fled or turned to looting and unchecked violence. Town after town fell. The propaganda on Ugandan radio grew desperate and shrill, claiming victories that did not exist. In reality, the map was turning against him. His government began to crumble. Allies slipped away. Some of his closest supporters fled the country. Inside Kampala, people sensed that the end was near, though they did not yet know exactly how it would come. In April 1979, Tanzanian forces and Ugandan exiles entered the capital. There were battles and shelling, but the defenders could not hold. The city that had once celebrated Amin's takeover in 1971 now saw his portrait torn down from walls, and his images removed from public buildings. Statues were toppled, and the symbols of his regime were smashed or defaced. The man who had styled himself as the defender and father of the nation had lost the capital he claimed to protect. Idi Amin did not stay to fight to the bitter end. As Kampala fell, he fled first to Libya, whose leader offered him temporary refuge, and later to Saudi Arabia, where he was granted asylum. His rule in Uganda lasted 8 years, but the scars it left would last far longer. In exile, he lived a quiet life, far from the country he had reshaped in blood. His large frame softened with age. The once powerful general became an aging man, walking the streets of Jeddah, going to the mosque, and disappearing into an apartment building like any other resident. He was never brought before an international tribunal, never tried in a court of law for the crimes committed under his rule. Journalists who managed to meet him found a man who sometimes laughed about his past, sometimes denied responsibility, sometimes claimed that history would judge him differently. From time to time, rumors circulated that he wished to return to Uganda, but the new authorities never allowed it. His name remained a symbol of horror, a ghost that no one wanted to invite back. In 2003, He died in a hospital in Saudi Arabia, reportedly from kidney failure. His death was quiet, far from the scenes of triumph and terror that had once surrounded him. There were no massive crowds, no military parades, no state mourning. His body was buried in a Saudi cemetery. On Ugandan soil, there was no official ceremony. Many people heard the news and felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that he was gone, anger that he had escaped justice, and a dull sadness for all that had been lost during his years in power. Uganda, by then, had moved on to new chapters, but the legacy of Idi Amin still cast a long shadow. His rule had destroyed lives, institutions, and trust. It had normalized fear and violence in politics. It had taught people that power could be used as an instrument of personal gain and revenge. Rebuilding from that required more than new leaders and fresh speeches. It required time, healing, and a careful effort to create structures that could resist the temptations of another strongman. Today, when people speak of Idi Amin, they often think in images. They see the towering figure in a highly decorated uniform, the dark glasses hiding his eyes, the broad smile that could turn lethal in an instant. They see the marketplaces filled with soldiers, the devastated shops after the expulsion of Asians, the trucks carrying prisoners to unseen places. They see the Entebbe terminal, the Tanzanian tanks rolling toward Kampala, and, finally, the quiet man in exile far from the land he once ruled. His story is not just the story of one man's cruelty. It is also the story of how fragile a young nation can be when its institutions are weak, when the army is given too much unchecked power, and when leaders are allowed to merge their personal ambitions with the destiny of the state. It is a warning about how quickly hope can be twisted into fear. When a society places its trust in a single figure instead of in laws, accountability, and shared responsibility. Idi Amin began life as a poor boy in a forgotten region. He became a soldier under a foreign flag, then a general under his own. He seized power with tanks and speeches, promising justice and unity. He ruled with laughter and terror, destroying those who opposed him and corrupting the structures meant to serve the people. He plunged his country into isolation, economic ruin, and war. And he ended his days in a foreign land, powerless, remembered not as a savior but as one of Africa's most feared dictators. From the village paths of West Nile to the corridors of power in Kampala, from the roaring crowds at rallies to the silent hospital room in distant exile, his life forms a single dark arc. It is an arc that bends across the history of Uganda and across the broader story of post-colonial Africa, a reminder of how much damage one man can do when a nation's fate is allowed to rest entirely in his hands. When Idi Amin fled Uganda in 1979, he left behind more than empty offices and abandoned mansions. He left a country that had been torn apart from the inside. The army was broken and distrusted. The economy was shattered. Entire communities had been traumatized by years of fear and sudden violence. The fall of the dictator did not instantly heal any of that. It simply opened a raw, uncertain space where new struggles began. After Amin's departure, a series of governments rose and fell in quick succession. Some were led by exiles who had fought alongside Tanzanian troops. Others emerged from factions within the army and political parties. Milton Obote returned to power for a time, but the Uganda he now governed was very different from the one he had led before. The institutions were weakened, the security forces were fragmented, and many people had lost faith in politics altogether. For ordinary Ugandans, life in the early post-Amin years was a mixture of relief and hardship. The constant fear of the dictator's unpredictable rage was gone. People could speak his name without whispering, yet the roads were still broken, factories still stood silent, and many families still had no answers about relatives who had disappeared. Memories of torture and mass killings remained unaddressed, like open wounds that no one knew how to treat. In the midst of this instability, new rebellions rose. Some were driven by personal ambition, others by ethnic grievances or ideological visions. The country slid again into conflict. In the mid-1980s, after years of guerrilla warfare, a rebel force led by Yoweri Museveni and the National Resistance Army took power in Kampala. This new leadership promised a fresh era of stability, reconstruction, and national healing. Under the new government, Uganda slowly began to rebuild. The economy was restructured, foreign aid and investment returned, and roads, schools, and hospitals were repaired or expanded. Refugees who had fled Amin's rule came back, bringing skills and capital. Over time, a generation grew up that had not personally known the terror of the 1970s. The country remained far from perfect and faced serious challenges, but it was no longer ruled by a man who treated it as his personal hunting ground. The memory of Idi Amin, however, did not disappear. It lived on in stories told around kitchen tables, in the silence of mass graves, and in the jagged pain of those who had lost parents, children, or friends. For many years, there were few formal processes to uncover the full truth of what had happened. Too many people had been involved, and too many new power structures were built on top of the old. The past was acknowledged, but often in broad strokes, without full detail or accountability. In time, historians, journalists, and survivors began to document the era more carefully. They collected testimonies, searched for documents, and tried to count the dead. Their work did not bring back the lives that had been taken, but it helped to fix the outlines of what had happened. The figure of Amin emerged clearly as a symbol of what can go wrong when a single man's will replaces the rule of law. Outside Uganda, Idi Amin became a global shorthand for monstrous rule. Films and books portrayed him as a madman, a caricature of African dictatorship. While some of these images were exaggerated or simplified, they reinforced the idea that his name belonged to the darkest chapters of modern history. For Ugandans, this outside attention was double-edged. On one hand, it kept the world from forgetting their suffering. On the other, it sometimes reduced their complex history to the story of one man's madness. Within Uganda, people continued to wrestle with questions that had no easy answers. How could a society protect itself from another Amin? How could they build institutions stronger than the ambitions of any individual? How should they remember the victims and educate the young without being trapped in hatred? In schools, churches, mosques, and community meetings, the shadow of the past shaped discussions about the future. For those who had lived through the 1970s, small, quiet changes marked the real difference. Being able to travel without fear of random roadblocks, being able to open a shop without worrying that soldiers would seize it, being able to speak critically about leaders without expecting a midnight knock on the door. These everyday freedoms were fragile, but they were also precious. They were the opposite of everything Idi Amin had represented. In his final years in Saudi Arabia, Amin watched Uganda from a distance. He saw, if he chose to look, a country that continued without him, rebuilding itself step by step. He never returned, never sat in a courtroom to face questions about the deaths and disappearances. His story ended quietly, in a hospital room far from the Nile. The silence that followed his death contrasted sharply with the noise and violence that had marked his rule. For Uganda, the end of Idi Amin was not a neat conclusion, but a turning point. The country would still face conflicts, political struggles, and debates about democracy and power, but the figure of the dictator remained in the background as a warning sign. Whenever leaders accumulated too much authority, whenever security forces acted above the law, whenever fear crept back into public light, people could look back and remember where that road had once led. The legacy of Idi Amin is, in the end, a lesson written in the lives of millions. It teaches that a nation must never surrender its institutions entirely to one man. No matter how strong, charming, or popular he may seem at first, it teaches that justice delayed may still be justice pursued through memory and truth, even if courts remain silent. And it teaches that recovery from such darkness is possible but slow, requiring patience, courage, and a commitment to never repeating the same path. Uganda today is not the Uganda of Amin. The faces in power have changed, the streets have changed. The children playing in those streets have never seen him, but the story of his rise and fall remains essential to understanding what the country has become. The echo of his rule lives on, not to glorify him, but to remind everyone who listens that power without restraint can destroy a nation, and that the task of rebuilding it, though difficult, belongs to those who refuse to forget. Chat Cookie.